Thank you so much. We compiled, with a lot of help from our experts, a summary of some of the peer-reviewed science, some of the up-to-date scientific information, and you can find copies of that on the table in the back in both English, and there's also a translation in Spanish for those who'd like to take that home. We're going to open it up for a question and answer session. Before we do that, I want to acknowledge the presence of representatives of some elected officials and others here in the room tonight. We have the General Counsel of the Bronx Borough President here. The Bronx Borough President VP Diaz Jr. has been a huge stalwart supporter on this from the beginning, and we're massively appreciative of the way he's put himself out in front on it. I see that AC Cumberbatch from 32BJ came into the room. Salim Mizrahi is here from Congressman Nadler's office. She's the Manhattan director. And the congressman, just as he was out front after 9/11, has been hugely important and supportive on this issue as well. There are UFT members here. In addition, I know Mike McCourt, who's a district rep, is here. And we have from the office of Council Member Al Van, Mandela Jones. And I hope that I'm not missing anybody who I should be acknowledging. Please make yourself known if I am. Eli, I'm so sorry. Eli are one of our co-sponsors. Which, as I mentioned before, 32BJ is also a co-sponsor of this event, along with NYCC and New York lawyers. And we also thanked the Teamsters for their hospitality earlier as well. So without further ado, let me turn it over to the audience for questions.
I have two questions on numbers that Dr. Herrick mentioned in his talk. One is, you said that they began manufacturing PCBs in the 20s, but yet in terms of their presence in school buildings, the problem begins around 1950, which was the date I had heard at previous meetings. So question one is, why did, if they were making them from the 20s, why did they not actually become a problem in terms of presence in school buildings till 30 years later? And the other one is, I had heard at previous meetings that for buildings constructed between 50 and 78, depending on what manufacturer the cork was purchased from, there was roughly a 40% likelihood of it being, PCBs being in buildings. You said 2/3, so maybe you could address those two.
Sure, on the first point, I think it was a matter of people, all these smart chemists over time started figuring out that there were lots of things that PCBs were good at doing. And originally it was in electrical fixtures and capacitors and things like that, because PCBs don't conduct electricity. They're really good insulators. They don't burn for the most part. So, I think what happened is over time they realized that there were other applications, other commercial applications, and so by the time all this construction took place in the 50s, that's when you really started seeing this stuff added, because it was really good at making that caulk rubbery and plasticky. In fact, our collaborator, a retired bricklayer who's been working with us on this project, he installed this stuff in hundreds of buildings all over New England, and he refers to it as the Cadillac of caulks. This was the top-notch stuff. If you wanted the best possible material, you specified the stuff with the PCBs in it. So, and then as to your second question, the proportion of buildings that have PCBs in it, it could easily be 40%, it could easily be 65%. The point, I think, is that one of the things we asked in 2004 is that EPA do a national survey and just get their arms around the size of this problem. What portion of the buildings, not just the schools, but all the buildings in the U.S., masonry buildings constructed during that era, have PCBs in it? Then you could get a little sense of how big is the risk that we're really faced with, and to this day, they've not addressed that question.
Is it, just one follow-up, is it true that what I heard that only if the caulk was manufactured in that period by Monsanto, do you likely have a problem, or did other manufacturers use it as well?
In the U.S., Monsanto was the only producer of the PCB itself. They would then send that out to smaller companies that formulated it and made it into the caulk. And those were companies with names like Glidden, names that you've probably heard. But ultimately, Monsanto, was the producer. I think Valerie knows the. Did you have a
Question?
is it on that point or something?
No, it was a different point.
Oh, go ahead.
So my question is, we obviously need to have some remediation, so the things that I've read talk about either removing the caulk or maybe encasing the caulk. So I just wondered if you had an opinion about whether you think that, let me just back up for a second and say that I know that removing the caulk sometimes presents problems because surrounding materials around the caulk may have PCBs in them because it's seeped into those materials. And if you just take out the caulk, then you leave those surrounding materials, and then it seeps back into the new caulk. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's been demonstrated.
Yeah, and then another idea is to encase the caulk, and I just wondered whether that was something that you thought might be a really viable option.
Yeah.
Anybody's opinion on that?
Yeah, I'll give you my opinion. I mean, in fact, those of us who live in New England and here in New York, we're sort of the experimental rats as far as what EPA is doing, because it's been our two parts of the country where the greatest amount of attention has been focused on this, and there have been plans that EPA had to approve to deal with the problem. And so, for example, up where we are, there's so many buildings that have the caulk and have to try to find ways to finance this removal of all this masonry, and this can involve grinding out 2 or 3 rows of bricks because the PCB in the 30 or 40 years it's been in there has permeated out into that surrounding material. So if you're going to really clean up the building, you can't just take out the old caulking, you got to grind out that old masonry, and that gets to be hugely expensive. And so in one building in our region, they gave them a permission to try an experiment where they're leaving the masonry in place, but they're coating it with epoxy to see if that immobilizes the PCB and keeps it from leaching out into the environment.
So you'd have to coat the caulk and the surrounding masonry.
Well, you take the caulking, and Sean might, he's a lot closer to the, got his hands on the tools than I do, but from what I've seen is you've got to get the caulking out of there, but then rather than pull out all those bricks and stones, you can coat those with epoxy.
If I can just add something really quickly, and Sean, please correct me if this is wrong. My understanding is that EPA has tested a number of different methods of encapsulating or coating PCBs, but that they haven't found anything that works yet. It doesn't mean they won't, but PCBs readily penetrate most solids, including, for example, human skin. So they haven't found something that works yet. This is not a situation like lead or asbestos where if it looks intact, you're not being exposed. From intact caulk, the PCBs enter the air, and they haven't found a way to prevent that from happening yet, which does not mean that they won't, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, the best method to really protect anyone from this stuff is to eliminate it. But the doctor's right, it's very expensive. I understand why building owners wouldn't want to do it. I understand why the city might not want to do it. But in the end, if it's going to cost lives, the expense is well worth it. So yeah, you have to weigh one against the other.
How do you dispose of PCBs when you remove them?
Well, the EPA has recommendations. It is, as I understand, and Joe, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, much like asbestos. Asbestos comes from the ground, has to go back into the ground. PCBs, I believe, have to be encased in some form or fashion, generally in drums, and also disposed of in some sort of fill.